Welcome to the year 1070 CE. In South India, the legendary Chola Empire teeters on the brink of collapse. The emperor is dead, and the conflict over royal succession could spiral into an all-out war. In the Deccan, the ambitious Vikramaditya seeks to place a puppet king on the now vulnerable Chola throne, part of his larger plan to conquer all of India. Vikramaditya might have gotten away with it too, if it wasn't for a meddling prince known as Kulotunga. Kulotunga was no ordinary man. He was a decisive commander who took brilliant, calculated risks, and in an era of change and uncertainty, he saved the Chola Empire and rebuilt it as a nimble superpower. This is the story of an empire reforged in the fires of conflict. By the mid-11th century, the Chola Empire had transformed itself from a small local kingdom into a large multi-ethnic powerhouse. How? First, the Cholas swallowed up their previous masters when they were at their most vulnerable. Then came the one-two punch of Rajaraja and Rajendra Chola. In just a short time, they submitted the remainder of Tamil country, the southern Deccan, Andhra, Kerala, and Sri Lanka. They also defeated the forces of Orissa and Bengal and set up a forward base on the Andaman and Nicobar Islands. Having subdued all their maritime rivals in India, the Cholas were free to launch a coordinated naval assault on the Malay archipelago. This invasion ended the Sailendra dynasty of the Srivijaya Empire and made the Chola Empire a major player in Southeast Asian trade and politics. The Cholas didn't just squander their success, they created a true imperial system with a highly centralized form of government. This included data-driven, centralized taxation, and even a viceroy system, replacing local nobility with Chola royals. But time humbles all empires. Following the death of Rajendra Chola in 1044 CE, 3 of his children ruled in rapid succession. The empire was on a steady decline. This decline was in part linked to the conflicts between the Cholas and the Chalukyas, their hated rival. By 1070 CE, the Cholas and Chalukyas had gone to war countless times. The hatred ran so deep, one inscription brags about killing more than 1 million innocent Chalukya civilians. Though this was very likely an exaggerated figure, why was there so much conflict? Simply put, the two powers had been locked in a relentless struggle for control over fertile riverine deltas and key ports. Take the Andhra coast, for example. Modern scholars estimate that in the 11th century, an acre of land in Andhra was so productive that it was worth up to 10 times as much as an acre of land in the semi-arid hinterlands. Control over these more valuable subregions gave rise to many wars. But this bloody dynamic was about to be shaken up. Meet Vikramaditya VI. Though he was the younger brother of the Chalukya emperor, he had designs for the throne. After all, Vikramaditya was a brilliant commander who led successful military campaigns deep into North India. Well, in 1068 CE, the Cholas invaded Chalukya territory. Vikramaditya sprang into action, not as a commander, but as a diplomat. He painted his older brother as a warmonger, and, going behind his back, allied with several Chalukya feudatories. Then he independently brokered a peace deal with the enemy. The peace deal also included an important provision. Vikramaditya would marry a Chola princess, Veera Rajendra's daughter. All this independent politicking caused the Chalukya Empire to split in half. Vikramaditya became the king of the southern portion. Conquering the northern half would just have to wait until a more opportune time. But the good news didn't stop there. In 1070 CE, his new father-in-law suddenly died. The deceased emperor's son, Adhirajendra, was his brother-in-law, and Vikramaditya exploited this family connection. He aimed to make Adhirajendra his puppet and absorbed the Chola Empire into his own. It seemed as though the Chola Empire would soon collapse, but a distant Telugu prince was not about to let that happen. Kulotunga was born to lead. His mother Amangai Devi was a Chola princess, and his father Raja Rajendra was the king of Vengi. In other words, Kulotunga was the legitimate heir to the kingdom of Vengi and a potential claimant to the throne of the Chola Empire. Quick note, the kingdom of Vengi was a powerful, semi-independent subordinate of the Chola Empire. Vengi is a close analog to what today we refer to as Andhra. Okay, back to Kulotunga. As a boy with Chola royal blood, he was raised up in the capital of Gangaikonda Cholapuram to ensure his proper training. And as he grew into a capable adult, his intelligence was exploited for the empire's benefit. Kulothunga was sent to the fringes of the empire to reassert Chola authority over problematic tributaries. He led military expeditions into Kalinga and brought several Odia subregions back under the ambit of Chola authority. He did the same in Chhattisgarh. Kulothunga was even sent across the Indian Ocean, where he led a successful naval expedition against Kadaram in northern Malaysia. He ousted the king in Kadaram and placed a loyal vassal on the throne. Ambitious rivals took notice of his rising star. See, political opportunists had much to gain from the collapse of the Chola Empire, and Kulothunga's leadership could prevent a collapse. Thus began the meddling. In 1061 CE, Kulothunga's father, the king of Vengi, died. Enemies and rivals sought to undermine Kulothunga by supporting the ascension of his uncle to the throne of Vengi. But what his detractors failed to account for was his grit and determination. Using the forces that remained loyal to him, he carved out a principality for himself in Chakrakot, in modern Chhattisgarh, and began gathering an army. He waited and waited. Then, in 1070 CE, the sudden death of Emperor Virurajendra Chola created an opportunity. Recall that Vikramaditya placed his own brother-in-law, Adhirajendra, on the Chola throne as a puppet. South Indian records describe this as a time of anarchy. There was widespread fear that external forces would envelop and destroy the empire. In the midst of all this chaos, Kulothunga sought to ascend the Chola throne, using his maternal lineage as the basis for his claim. But it wouldn't be easy. To succeed, he'd have to take Vengi first, and he'd have to do it fast, too. In just a few months, Kulothunga stormed Vengi and reclaimed his paternal inheritance. This victory was a strategic one, and so he not only spared his uncle's life, but allowed him to continue as a subordinate. What Kulothunga received in return was the military personnel and logistics support to threaten the Chola heartland. After this, most historians believe that Kulothunga did invade the Tamil heartland, coming head-to-head with the puppet Adhirajendra. Adhirajendra was in an unenviable position. See, there was still plenty of Chola loyalists around, and they were legitimately concerned about Adhirajendra being nothing more than a Chalukya puppet. Furthermore, records indicate that he was religiously intolerant and that he suppressed the popular Vaishnava saint Ramanuja and his followers. Suffice to say, Adhirajendra had no goodwill among his own people. Though we don't know exactly what happened during Kulothunga's invasion, we do know that Adhirajendra died in the conflict over the throne, perhaps due to infighting. With the puppet dead, Kulothunga was crowned the new Chola emperor. His ascension marked the beginning of a new dynasty. In the beginning, Kulothunga's reign was focused on healing a severed empire. The Chola Empire lost control of many territories in 1070 CE during the period of anarchy and political chaos that we just described. As usual, that ambitious pain in the behind, Vikramaditya, had his fingerprints all over the situation. He actively supported rebellions throughout the Chola Empire, in Sri Lanka, in the Deccan, in Kerala, in Pandya country, and elsewhere. Kulothunga spent several years recapturing and reintegrating rebellious territories, but violence couldn't solve all problems. For example, in 1070 CE, the Sinhalese rebelled against Chola rule, thanks to the treachery of a Chola governor. Vikramaditya supported the rebellion too. In the end, the Sinhalese succeeded in retaking the island. Kulothunga was furious at the betrayal of his subordinate, but he let the Sinhalese keep Sri Lanka. Why? Sri Lanka was a manageable loss. The Cholas still had excellent ports along the Malabar and Coromandel coasts. Besides, Kulothunga could reallocate resources to strengthen and consolidate the empire. This was an absolutely brilliant decision. It really wasn't worth fighting for Lanka, because an invasion was about to land on his doorstep. In 1075 CE, Kulothunga's uncle finally died. Remember him? He's the guy who had been allowed to rule Vengi as a subordinate. Now Kulothunga, who held royal title through his father, was finally in position to ascend the Vengi throne himself. This would allow him to unite the kingdom of Vengi with the Chola Empire. Full integration. Recall that Vengi was no ordinary kingdom. Its lands were extremely valuable. The union of Vengi with the Chola Empire would create a powerful entity, one that was arguably greater than it had ever been in the past. The enemies of the Chola Empire seethed with anger. This could not be allowed. Remember Vikramaditya? Public enemy number one for the Cholas? Yeah, that guy. Well, he immediately launched an invasion to prevent Kulothunga from successfully uniting the kingdom of Vengi and the Chola Empire under one house. He had also secured the assistance of Rajaraja Deva, the king of Kalinga, who also coveted the valuable lands of Vengi for himself. But Kulothunga was ready. He and his forces successfully routed the invaders on different fronts. In fact, the Cholas repulsed the Chalukyas so effectively that they were able to respond with a counter-invasion, securing territories all the way to Mysore. Vikramaditya understood that he would have to accept defeat for now. He struck a deal with Kulothunga, and an era of relative peace between the Chalukyas and Cholas began. With peace secured, Vikramaditya decided to look north at his brother's portion of the Chalukya Empire. Less than a year after his failed invasion of Vengi, he defeated his brother and reunited both halves of the Chalukya Empire as its new leader. We've talked about the Chalukya front during the Vengi War, but what about the Kalinga front? Well, once the Cholas repulsed the Kalinga armies, they engaged in a counter-invasion on that front too. Kulothunga secured enough authority over Kalinga that he was able to install his own sons as viceroys. In fact, his sons were put directly in charge of Rajaraja Deva's young heir, Anantavarman. Fun fact, Anantavarman was himself a prince with Chola royal blood, and was likely the nephew of Kulothunga. Over the next few centuries, many Kalinga leaders would take the name Chodaganga to reference their Chola heritage. In 1078 CE, Kulothunga turned to the final barrier to peace and stability in the Chola Empire, the Pandyas. This time, administrative competence was required. The Pandyas were also Tamils, but they were longtime rivals and had adopted an aggressive posture towards Chola rule. In the past, the viceroy system had sort of worked in Pandya territory, but the situation was getting worse over time. It seemed like the Pandyas would never truly accept being bossed around by the Cholas. Kulothunga allowed them to operate as semi-independent feudatories. To ensure that they remained under the ambit of Chola authority, he built military cantonments in their territories. Peace and stability was finally secured, and a golden age dawned. Kulothunga is best known for his smart governance. The records of Kulothunga's reign lionize many of his ministers and close allies. Kulothunga understood that to rule over a prosperous empire, one must have a keen eye for talent and must delegate powers appropriately. From an administrative standpoint, Kulothunga had a pro-trade approach. This reflects the dynamics of the Asian economy at the time, which had become increasingly dependent on the maritime sea trade between the Middle East, India, Southeast Asia, and China. In fact, Kulothunga ensured that Chola ports would dominate the Indosphere by abolishing all duties and tolls on trade. It's likely that this decision was influenced by the prominent merchant guilds of his era. Though South Indian merchant guilds were already quite powerful by the early 11th century, their influence only grew as the century developed. By the late 11th century, the merchant guilds were so influential that they maintained private armies and funded entire wars. They even operated global trade networks with merchant diplomats who negotiated their own deals with foreign governments. Kulothunga's flexible, practical nature was well suited to governing in an era where financial capital had become an increasingly important political force. He was able to strike a balance between the need to govern an empire of many millions with the concerns of the guilds. The record makes it clear that Kulothunga's long reign was one of relative peace and prosperity for the common man, but he also made the guilds happy by ensuring their continued success and dominance in Asian maritime trade. For example, Kulothunga continued Chola interventionist policy in Southeast Asia. Numerous Southeast Asian kingdoms, from Pegu to Angkor, sent gifts and royal embassies to the Chola capital. And Kulothunga also sent embassies abroad, including Song China. Meanwhile, in India, when any lords attempted to undermine Chola authority, Kulothunga was swift and brutal with his response. Sometime in the early 12th century, Kalinga was ruled by Anantavarman, if you recall, a nephew of Kulothunga. Well, Anantavarman attempted to skirt Chola authority by refusing to make his feudatory tribute payments for 2 years in a row. Kulothunga sent his best general, Karunakara, to handle the situation. Karunakara invaded Kalinga and routed Anantavarman, ousting him from power. In fact, the historical record indicates that Anantavarman was never heard from again. Having thus laid waste the whole of the seacoast kingdom of Kalinga, Karunakara Tandaman returns and lies at the feet of his master all the spoils of war. Kulothunga's persistence and intelligence rejuvenated the Chola Empire in a time of uncertainty. His name deserves to be spoken amongst the many greats of Indian history. And now you know.